On the 24th of November 1941, a young lady was brought to her execution inside of a town in Yugoslavia. She was to be executed not on the gallows, but by what was known as pole hanging. This method utilised a post to condemn someone on, and it was a rather shocking execution method, but the crowds still came in their huge numbers to witness the method being carried out. Lili Böhm was one of a number of young women who during the Second World War were thrust into the heart of the conflict, and she paid the ultimate price for this, as she was executed by her enemies. But what is her story, and what happened with her execution? Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. There were many countries that fell under German occupation and Axis influence during the Second World War, and collaborated with the Nazis. On the 25th of March 1941, Yugoslavia joined the Axis alliance, and this allowed the Germans to travel through their land to Greece. But the Axis powers later partitioned Yugoslavia, and inside of the different territories, there was a huge amount of terror which was carried out. Different groups such as the Ustaša militia instigated a reign of brutality upon people and civilians, and there were widespread executions and deportations to concentration and extermination camps. Lili Böhm was just 20 years old when she was executed, and very little is actually known about her life. She, during the Second World War, joined a Jewish youth organisation known as the Young Guard in her local town of Novi Sad. But during the conflict, her part of the country was invaded by the Hungarian military and army, who were in collusion with the Nazis. There were many people who did resist, and often resistance was met with the most brutal of reprisals, and people suspected of subverting occupying forces could be tortured, sometimes even to death. Lili Böhm got involved in the organisation of resistance activities against the Hungarians, and she also took part in groups who sabotaged Hungarian soldiers. This was a crime that carried the death sentence, and Lili Böhm knew how dangerous it was for her to resist. Being a woman too, she knew that she could be subjected to other horrors if she was also caught. But it was not long before she fell into the hands of her enemies. On the 20th of September 1941, Lili Böhm was caught by the Hungarian gendarmerie and the occupying police forces. Specifically on her person, she was carrying a weapon, and further investigations turned up that she was part of resistance cells, and that she was either harbouring and hiding weapons for resistors, or that she intended to use the weapon against Hungarian occupation forces. It's not known specifically what her intention was that day, but the crime of carrying a weapon was enough for her to be sentenced to death. It's assumed that she had a rough ordeal in prison locked up too, and the military court confirmed her execution. For a couple of months, Lili Böhm was left inside of a Hungarian-occupied prison in Újvidék, and she was held alongside other suspected resistors, but she was to be executed by pole hanging. On the 25th of November 1941, Lili Böhm was led out of her prison to her execution, and she was accompanied by a number of guards. Some of them walked her to the execution post, and she was greeted by the executioners who would take her life on the post. There was a large crowd gathered by the occupying forces to witness her execution, and the soldiers hoped that seeing this 20-year-old woman be executed in front of them would be enough to put the crowds off committing serious offences, and most importantly, prevent them from joining resistance groups and cells. With regards to Lili Böhm's execution method of pole hanging, it was a variation of the short drop execution method, and it was used inside different lands and countries such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It used a pole or post for the gallows, and there were different steps for it to be carried out. It was referred to as a Vergelegen, which translates as the strangling gallows, and it appeared to crowds a rather brutal execution method. There were a number of steps, and the condemned was brought to the post or pillar, which was usually 3 meters tall, and then ropes were attached to the condemned. A rope was attached around their feet, and it was then secured through a pulley system at the bottom and base of the post, and the condemned were held in the air by a chest sling, which passed over their body and under their arms. This held them still before the drop, and then the noose was secured around the neck of the victim, and the noose was secured to a hook at the top of the pole, and then the death sentence was usually read. Next, a chest sling was released, and the victim then jerked downwards, and the assistant executioner used a foot rope to guide the fall, and the executioner was usually more senior and experienced, and he would be stood on the platform behind the post. It was his job to place the heel of his hand under the jaw of the condemned, and this would increase the force on the neck and make this greater at the end of the drop, and the executioner, it was said, would manually dislocate the neck of the condemned by thrusting and forcing their head to one side. Pole hanging was considered by some to have been a much more humane and quicker execution method than even using the gallows, and it took roughly around a minute for someone to die when performed successfully. It was this fate that Lili Böhm suffered. She was led up to the post and was held on it by a chest sling, and the executioner then secured the ropes around the pulley system and her body, and then the noose was secured around her neck. Her post, though, was not too tall, and it was certainly not 3 meters tall, and the executioner and his assistant then worked together to bring her life to an end. She was wearing a dark dress, and she had her arms secured to the post, and had no chance of escaping her fate on the execution post, as she was surrounded by many different Hungarian guards. These showed their collaboration to the Axis forces and alliance, as they were even wearing the classic German Stahlhelm, and to prevent people saving the young 20-year-old Lili Böhm, 2 guards stood directly next to her body, and they guarded closely over it. Lili Böhm was not the only woman who was subjected to a fate like this during the Second World War. There were many young women who were arrested and were seized for allegedly being involved in resistance against the Germans or the Axis forces. It was a very dangerous time, and Lili Böhm, let's remember, was a Jewish woman who knew the persecution that was coming if she did not join the resistance, and she fought the occupation that she was forced to live under. She was executed for rather flimsy reasons, carrying a weapon in public, which during a time of conflict and war was not necessarily a huge shock. She may have had this on her person for personal protection, but as she was discovered to have been part of a resistance group, the Young Guard, this was enough for her to be sent to her execution. She likely had a rough interrogation ordeal before she was sentenced to death, and her body was left on the post for a while, so that a clear message could be sent to those in the local area. This was done to deter other people from joining the resistance, and was done to make people fall into line and not take up arms against the German enemy or the Axis enemy. One of the greatest fears of the Axis forces, who rolled into many different countries during World War II, was resistance, and to them, everyone was a suspect. Lili Böhm was just a young 20-year-old woman when she was dragged to her execution on the post in front of a large crowd. There were teenagers who were executed by occupying forces during World War II, with some being hanged from trees for their suspected or confirmed resistance, and Lili Böhm's story is one which is not the most well known, and she deserves to be remembered for her actions in standing up to her enemies inside of her homelands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.